February 19th, 1945, 2:47 a.m., Ramree Island, Burma. Lieutenant James Lovell of the Royal Marines 3rd Commando Brigade stood at his observation post on the eastern shore of Ramree Island, listening to sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. From somewhere in the darkness of the mangrove swamp, 2 miles to the west, came screaming, not the sharp, brief screams of men hit by gunfire. These were prolonged, agonized shrieks that rose and fell, multiplied by hundreds, creating a chorus of terror that carried across the water. "Sir," his radioman whispered, his voice shaking, "what's happening out there?" Lovell lowered his binoculars. He'd seen combat across Burma and India. He'd witnessed banzai charges, artillery barrages, and close quarters fighting. But he'd never heard anything like this. The screaming had started at dusk 6 hours ago, and hadn't stopped. If anything, it was intensifying. They went into the swamp, Lovell said quietly. "Japanese forces, about 1,000 men, retreating rather than surrendering. They're trapped in there with..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every soldier stationed on Ramree Island knew what lived in those swamps. Saltwater crocodiles, hundreds of them, some exceeding 20 feet in length. The local Burmese had a name for the mangrove marshes on the island's western shore. Jying, the place where men go to die. By dawn, when the screaming finally stopped, fewer than 500 Japanese soldiers would emerge alive. The rest would be victims of the largest crocodile attack in recorded history, a disaster so extreme that even now, 80 years later, historians debate whether it could possibly be true. This is that story. To understand what happened on Ramree Island, we must first understand why British and Japanese forces were fighting over a small island in the Bay of Bengal in early 1945. The Burma Campaign, called the Forgotten War by many historians, was one of World War II's longest and most brutal theaters. From 1942 to 1945, Allied forces fought to expel Japanese occupation from Burma modern-day Myanmar and reopen supply lines to China, which was fighting its own desperate war against Japanese invasion. By January 1945, Allied forces under General William Slim had pushed Japanese forces back across Burma in a series of offensives that shattered Japanese defensive lines. The British 14th Army, the Forgotten Army, as they called themselves, had proven capable of defeating Japanese forces in jungle warfare, reversing the string of defeats that had marked early war years. Ramree Island, located off Burma's Arakan coast, became strategically critical in January 1945. The island measured approximately 50 miles long and 20 miles wide, covered primarily in dense jungle and mangrove swamps. Its strategic value lay in its location and terrain. The island could support air bases and supply depots that would enable Allied forces to conduct operations deeper into Burma and eventually support the liberation of Malaya and Singapore. On January 14, 1945, British forces launched Operation Matador, the amphibious assault on Ramree Island. The operation involved the 71st Indian Infantry Brigade, supported by Royal Marines commandos and Royal Navy warships providing offshore bombardment. Japanese forces defending the island belonged to the 54th Division, a unit that had fought across the Pacific and Southeast Asia since 1941. The initial landings met lighter resistance than expected. British forces established beachheads on the island's northern and eastern shores, then began pushing inland through dense jungle. Japanese defenders fought delaying actions, using prepared defensive positions to slow Allied advance while avoiding pitched battles they couldn't win. By early February, British forces controlled approximately 70% of Ramree Island. Japanese defenders had been pushed back into the island's western regions, areas dominated by mangrove swamps that extended for miles along the coast. These weren't the romantic jungle landscapes of adventure stories. They were nightmarish environments, knee-deep to chest, deep water, thick mud that could trap a man, tangled roots that blocked movement, and visibility measured in yards rather than miles. And they were home to saltwater crocodiles, Crocodilus porosus, The saltwater or estuarine crocodile is the largest living reptile species. Adult males commonly reach 17 feet in length and weigh 1,000 pounds. Exceptional specimens exceed 20 feet and 2,000 pounds. They possess the strongest bite force of any animal ever measured, over 3,700 pounds per square inch, more than twice the bite force of a great white shark. Saltwater crocodiles are apex predators that have remained essentially unchanged for 200 million years because their design is perfect for their environment. They hunt by ambush, lying motionless in murky water with only their eyes and nostrils exposed, waiting for prey to approach. When they strike, they move with explosive speed, accelerating from stillness to attack in less than a second, clamping jaws around prey before victims can react. They're also extraordinarily aggressive, particularly during breeding season and when defending territories. Unlike alligators, which generally avoid humans unless threatened or starved, saltwater crocodiles actively hunt humans. They are responsible for more human fatalities than any other crocodilian, species estimated at 1,000 deaths per year in modern times, when human populations live near crocodile habitats. The mangrove swamps of Ramree Island in 1945 supported one of the densest crocodile populations in Southeast Asia. The local Burmese population avoided these areas, conducting fishing and agriculture only in regions far from the mangroves. British forces had received warnings about crocodiles during their initial planning, but had dismissed them as exaggerated local superstition. They were about to learn otherwise. By February 15, 1945, approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers were trapped in a shrinking defensive perimeter on Ramree Island's western shore. They belonged primarily to the 54th Division's rear, guard element, infantry companies, artillery crews whose guns had been destroyed or abandoned, support personnel, and wounded soldiers who could still move but couldn't fight effectively. Their commander, Colonel Kiyoshi Nagasawa, faced an impossible tactical situation. British forces controlled the island's eastern regions and were advancing westward, supported by artillery, airstrikes, and naval bombardment. To the west lay 10 miles of mangrove swamp, then open water of the Bay of Bengal. To the north and south, British forces had established blocking positions preventing escape routes. Nagasawa had 3 options, all terrible. First, he could surrender. Japanese military doctrine and cultural conditioning made this psychologically impossible for most officers. Surrender meant dishonor not only for the individual, but for their families. The Senjin-kan, the military code issued to all Japanese soldiers, explicitly stated that surrender was forbidden under any circumstances. Soldiers were expected to fight to death or commit suicide rather than be captured. Second, he could mount a last, stand defense at his current position. This would result in annihilation within days. British forces had overwhelming superiority in firepower, supplies, and tactical position. A defensive stand would accomplish nothing except delaying British advance by perhaps 48 hours, while all defending Japanese forces died. Third, he could attempt to break through the encirclement by traversing the mangrove swamp to reach Japanese-held territory on the mainland, approximately 15 miles away across open water. If his forces could reach the mainland coast, they could link up with other Japanese units and continue fighting. Colonel Nagasawa chose the third option. He ordered his forces to prepare for a nighttime retreat through the swamp. The decision was militarily rational given his constraints and cultural context. Moving at night would provide cover from British air attacks and reduce exposure to artillery fire. The swamp, while difficult terrain, was navigable. Local Burmese did cross these areas when necessary, and attempting breakout, even if it failed, was preferable to passive destruction or shameful surrender. What Nagasawa apparently didn't fully understand was the nature of the swamp environment during breeding season, the density of the crocodile population, and how his wounded, exhausted soldiers would fare against the apex predators that dominated that environment. British intelligence observed Japanese preparations throughout February 18th. Reconnaissance aircraft reported that Japanese positions were being abandoned, with troops moving toward the swamp's edge. British commanders discussed options for interdicting the retreat, but concluded that allowing Japanese forces to enter the swamp served Allied strategic interests. "Let them go," one British officer reportedly said. "The swamp will do our work for us." At approximately 6 p.m. on February 19, 1945, Japanese forces began entering the swamp. They moved in columns, attempting to maintain unit cohesion in the darkness. Officers led from the front. Wounded soldiers were helped by their comrades. Equipment was stripped to essentials: rifles, ammunition, water canteens, and minimal rations. The water level ranged from ankle, deep in some areas, to chest, deep in others. The bottom was thick mud that sucked at boots and legs, making each step exhausting. Visibility in the darkness was essentially zero. Men moved by following the soldier ahead of them, maintaining contact by voice and touch. And within minutes of entering the water, they attracted attention. To understand what happened next, we need to understand saltwater crocodile behavior, particularly in the conditions present on Ramree Island in February 1945. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators with sensory capabilities that make them extraordinarily effective hunters in murky water. Their eyes contain a reflective layer called the tapetum lucidum that enhances vision in low light. This is what causes the distinctive eyeshine when lights hit crocodile eyes in darkness. They can see clearly in conditions humans would consider total darkness. Their skin contains pressure-sensitive organs called integumentary sense organs that detect vibrations in water from remarkable distances. A crocodile can sense splashing, swimming movements, or struggling prey from several hundred yards away. This sensory system is so sensitive that crocodiles can detect ripples from a fish swimming on the opposite side of a body of water. They also detect chemical signals: blood, stress hormones, and other compounds released by wounded or frightened prey. When blood enters the water, crocodiles can detect it in concentrations as low as 1 part per million, drawing them toward the source like sharks responding to a blood trail. In February 1945, the conditions in Ramree's mangrove swamps created a perfect storm for crocodile predation. First, it was late dry season. Water levels were lower than usual, concentrating crocodiles into smaller areas. Crocodiles that normally ranged across miles of territory were forced into proximity with each other, increasing territorial aggression and competition for food sources. Second, it was approaching breeding season. Male saltwater crocodiles become extraordinarily aggressive during this period, attacking anything that enters their territories, including other crocodiles. Females guarding nests attack any potential threat, regardless of size. Third, the Japanese soldiers presented optimal prey characteristics. They were wounded, many bleeding into the water, exhausted, unable to move quickly or defend effectively, and making noise splashing, voices, equipment clanking. Every behavioral trigger that attracts crocodile attention was present. Fourth, the density of prey was unprecedented. In natural conditions, a crocodile might encounter 1 or 2 prey animals per night. Suddenly, their territory contained hundreds of potential meals moving through the water in concentrated groups. When one crocodile attacks, others are attracted by the splashing and blood. This creates a feeding frenzy where multiple crocodiles converge on a location, competing for food and becoming increasingly aggressive. The more crocodiles present, the more violent the competition becomes. A saltwater crocodile attack follows a predictable pattern. The crocodile approaches submerged, using pressure sensors to track prey movement. When within range, typically 10 to 15 feet, the crocodile accelerates from stillness to attack speed in a single explosive motion. The jaws close around the victim with a bite force that crushes bones and punctures organs. What happens next depends on the prey's size. Smaller prey animals under 100 pounds are typically shaken violently to break their necks, then swallowed whole or in large pieces. Larger prey, including humans, are subjected to a behavior called the death roll. The crocodile clamps its jaws on the victim, then rotates its entire body rapidly around its long axis, spinning like a torpedo. This generates enormous rotational forces that tear flesh, break bones, and disorient the victim. The crocodile repeats this maneuver multiple times, each rotation tearing away larger pieces of tissue. The victim drowns if they're dragged underwater, dies from blood loss if the bite severs major vessels, or dies from traumatic shock from the tissue damage. The entire attack, from initial bite to victim's death, typically takes 3 to 5 minutes for human-sized prey. But the victim is conscious for most of that time, experiencing extreme pain and terror as they're torn apart. Now imagine this happening not to one person, but to hundreds of people simultaneously, in darkness, in a swamp where escape is impossible because every direction contains more predators. That's what the Japanese soldiers encountered. The first attacks came within 30 minutes of the Japanese forces entering the swamp. Private Kiyoshi Yamamoto, one of the few survivors who later provided testimony to Allied interrogators, described the initial encounters. We heard splashing behind our column, then screaming. Men shouted warnings. We couldn't see what was happening. The screaming continued for several minutes. Then stopped. We kept moving. What else could we do? The pattern repeated every few minutes. Splashing, screaming, brief violent sounds, silence. The column kept moving, because stopping meant dying either from crocodiles or from British artillery that periodically fired illumination rounds and high explosive shells into the swamp, having calculated approximate routes the Japanese would take. As night deepened, the attacks intensified. Crocodiles that had made initial kills attracted other crocodiles through chemical signals and vibrations. The concentration of predators increased as more crocodiles converged on the area, drawn by the unprecedented food source. Sergeant Takeshi Nakamura, another survivor, recalled, "The crocodiles came from all sides. Men tried to climb on roots or trees to escape the water, but the crocodiles could climb too. They would lunge out of the water and drag men back in. We fired rifles at them, but bullets didn't stop them. Even when you shot them, they kept attacking." This observation aligns with crocodile physiology. Crocodiles have thick armored skin that deflects small caliber rounds unless they strike vital areas like the brain or heart, difficult targets on a moving animal in darkness. Wounded crocodiles often become more aggressive rather than retreating, continuing attacks even with multiple bullet wounds. The Japanese formation began breaking apart. Unit cohesion, essential for military effectiveness and psychological support, disintegrated as soldiers panicked. Men fled in different directions, spreading out across the swamp. This made them easier prey. Isolated individuals are more vulnerable than groups that can provide mutual defense. Some soldiers attempted to fight the crocodiles with bayonets and hand-to-hand weapons. These attempts were largely futile. A 150-pound human with a bayonet cannot effectively fight a 1,500-pound reptile with jaws capable of crushing bone. The few successful defenses involved multiple soldiers attacking a single crocodile simultaneously, usually after it had already killed and was distracted by feeding. The psychological horror was as devastating as the physical danger. Darkness prevented soldiers from seeing the attacks coming. They couldn't identify safe areas versus dangerous ones. They couldn't coordinate defenses or retreats. Every step might bring them within range of a hidden predator. Every splash might be a crocodile approaching. Every moment of silence meant waiting for the next attack. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, who survived by remaining on partially dry ground throughout the night, later described the sounds. The screaming never stopped. Sometimes it would be close, 50 meters away, sometimes distant, but always somewhere in the darkness men were dying. You could hear splashing when the crocodiles attacked. You could hear men begging for help. You could hear death. British forces positioned around the swamp's perimeter could hear it too. Lieutenant Lovell later wrote in his diary, "All night, the most appalling sounds came from the swamp. The screams were bad enough, but worse was hearing them suddenly cut off mid-cry. You knew what that meant. Some poor devil had just been dragged underwater. Then, after a few seconds of silence, the screaming would start again from somewhere else. Some Japanese soldiers tried to surrender, shouting toward British positions in broken English. British forces established procedure to accept surrenders. Soldiers would be allowed to approach, disarmed, and taken into custody. But reaching British lines meant crossing the swamp, and most men who attempted this journey never arrived. Others attempted to swim toward the mainland, hoping to cross the open water to reach Japanese-held territory. Few were strong swimmers, and the journey was over 15 miles. Those who entered open water either drowned from exhaustion or were attacked by crocodiles that inhabited coastal waters, attracted by the splashing of struggling swimmers. The majority of the Japanese force, perhaps 700 to 800 men, remained trapped in the swamp throughout the night. They climbed onto roots, clung to trees, stood in shallow areas, and tried to remain motionless, hoping crocodiles wouldn't detect them. Some succeeded in avoiding attack for hours, but exhaustion, wounds, and the constant psychological terror took their toll. Men who remained still for hours would eventually shift position, make noise, or fall asleep and slip into the water, attracting immediate attack. By 3 a.m., the peak of the attacks had passed. The crocodiles were sated, having fed on more prey in a single night than they normally consumed in months. The survivors, scattered, terrified, and traumatized, either huddled in hiding or attempted to navigate toward British lines. Dawn came at approximately 6 a.m. As grey light filtered through the mangrove canopy, the survivors could finally see their surroundings. What they saw would traumatize them for life. British patrols entered the swamp at first light on February 20th, conducting reconnaissance to assess Japanese force disposition and collect intelligence. What they found wasn't a military force. It was a massacre site. Naturalist Bruce Stanley Wright, serving with the British forces as a wildlife observer and military liaison, was among the first Allied personnel to enter the swamp after the night's events. His account, later published in his book, Wildlife Sketches Near and Far, provided the most detailed documentation of what happened. The scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp, punctured by the screams of wounded men crushed in the jaws of huge reptiles, and the blurred worrying sound of spinning crocodiles made a cacophony of hell that has rarely been duplicated on Earth. At dawn, the vultures arrived to clean up what the crocodiles had left. Of about 1,000 Japanese soldiers that entered the swamps of Ramree, only about 20 were found alive. Wright's estimate of 20 survivors was likely too low. British records document approximately 500 Japanese soldiers surrendering or being captured in the days following February 19th to 20th, including men who had bypassed the swamp entirely, taken alternative routes, or successfully navigated the swamp during daylight, when crocodile activity was reduced. But the physical evidence Wright and other British soldiers observed was undeniable. The swamp contained human remains scattered across miles of mangroves. Bodies, or parts of bodies, floating in water or caught in roots. Equipment scattered everywhere, rifles, helmets, boots, canteens. Blood staining the water in multiple locations, and the crocodiles, dozens of crocodiles, bloated from feeding, basking on mudflats and roots. Many still had visible wounds from Japanese rifle fire. Some were still feeding on remains in the water. Corporal James McLaughlin of the Royal Marines, part of the patrol that entered the swamp, later recalled, "We'd seen combat death before. Artillery casualties, machine gun fire, hand-to-hand fighting, but this was different. These men hadn't been killed in battle. They'd been hunted and eaten. Some bodies were missing entire limbs. Some were just torsos, and the crocodiles were everywhere, just lying there, too full to even move." The British patrols also found survivors, Japanese soldiers who'd managed to avoid attack by remaining on dry ground or in trees. These men were in shock, dehydrated, and traumatized. Many could barely speak. When questioned, their accounts corroborated what British forces had heard during the night. massive crocodile attacks that killed hundreds of men. Private Kiyoshi Yamamoto, who survived by climbing into a mangrove tree and remaining there for 14 hours, provided detailed testimony. "I saw at least 6 men killed by crocodiles within 20 meters of my position. The attacks were sudden. A splash, a man screaming, then he would be pulled underwater. Sometimes he would surface again, still screaming, then another crocodile would grab him. Sometimes 3 or 4 crocodiles fought over one man. The water would churn white, then turn red, then become still." The Japanese soldiers who did emerge from the swamp alive displayed extreme psychological trauma. Some were catatonic, unable to speak or respond to questions. Others were hysterical, screaming if they saw water or heard splashing sounds. British medical personnel treating these prisoners noted they displayed symptoms consistent with severe psychological shock, what we now recognize as acute PTSD. British forces made efforts to recover bodies for identification and documentation purposes, but the swamp's conditions and continued crocodile presence made this dangerous and often impossible. Many remains were left in the swamp, where scavengers, crocodiles, birds, insects, and bacteria completed the process of decomposition. The official British after-action reports documented the battle's conclusion matter of factly. Ramree Island secured February 22, 1945. Japanese resistance eliminated. Estimated 900 to 1,000 enemy casualties, majority occurring during retreat through swamp areas on western shore. British casualties, 20 killed, 124 wounded. The reports mentioned crocodiles only briefly, noting they contributed to enemy casualties during swamp transit. The full horror of what had occurred wasn't emphasized in official documents, partly because it seemed too extreme to be believable, partly because even hardened military officers found the details disturbing. But the story spread through British forces and eventually reached military historians and naturalist researchers. Wright's documentation became the primary historical source. When the Guinness Book of World Records began documenting extreme animal attack events in the 1960s, they listed Ramree Island as the worst crocodile disaster in world history. For decades, the Ramree Island crocodile massacre was accepted as historical fact. Wright's account was cited in numerous books and documentaries. The Guinness World Records listing gave it official recognition. The story became one of World War II's most notorious episodes, mentioned alongside more famous battles as an example of warfare's unexpected horrors. But in recent years, some historians have questioned the traditional narrative. They argue that the casualty numbers were exaggerated, that Wright's account may have been partially fictionalized, and that the crocodile deaths, while real, may have been fewer than claimed. The skeptical argument makes several points. First, Japanese records from the 54th Division show approximately 1,200 soldiers were present on Ramree Island at the start of February 1945. British records document approximately 500 Japanese prisoners captured during the battle. If 1,000 men died to crocodiles in one night, the total casualty count would exceed the total number of Japanese forces present, mathematically impossible unless Japanese reinforcements arrived that weren't documented. Second, Wright's account was published years after the events and may have been influenced by storytelling embellishments. He was a naturalist, not a military historian, and may have prioritized dramatic narrative over precise accuracy. His estimate of about 20 survivors is contradicted by British military records showing 500-plus prisoners. Third, some historians argue that most Japanese casualties likely resulted from combat artillery, airstrikes, small arms fire, disease and starvation, with crocodiles being a secondary cause of death. They suggest the crocodile story was amplified because it was more memorable than conventional combat deaths. However, defenders of the traditional account present counter-arguments. First, the mathematics work if you recognize that not all 1,000-plus Japanese forces attempted to cross the swamp. Some surrendered directly to British forces, some bypassed the swamp using alternative routes, some remained in defensive positions and were killed in combat. The approximately 900 to 1,000 men who entered the swamp represents a subset of total Japanese forces. Second, Wright's account is corroborated by multiple British soldiers who were present. Lieutenant Lovell's diary, Corporal McLaughlin's testimony, and reports from Royal Marines officers all describe hearing massive numbers of casualties occurring in the swamp on the night of February 19th to 20th. These multiple independent sources support Wright's narrative. Third, Japanese survivor testimonies, collected by Allied interrogators immediately after the events, describe massive crocodile attacks killing hundreds of men. These testimonies were given by traumatized soldiers who had no reason to fabricate details favorable to British propaganda. Fourth, the environmental conditions and crocodile behavior documented by herpetologists support the possibility of mass predation. Saltwater crocodiles in high-density populations during breeding season are extraordinarily aggressive. Wounded, exhausted humans entering their territory at night would trigger predatory responses from multiple animals simultaneously. Modern herpetologist Dr. Adam Britton, a leading expert on saltwater crocodiles, has stated, "While the exact numbers may be debated, the basic scenario described at Ramree Island is entirely plausible from a behavioral standpoint. Saltwater crocodiles are opportunistic predators that will attack humans, especially when humans are vulnerable. A large concentration of wounded, tired men moving through crocodile habitat at night would absolutely trigger predation events. Whether it was 500 deaths or 1,000 deaths is less important than recognizing that crocodile predation was a significant cause of casualties, something almost unique in modern warfare. The truth likely falls somewhere between the extremes. Not every Japanese soldier who died that night was killed by crocodiles. Some died from combat wounds, some drowned, some died from exhaustion or disease. But crocodile attacks were clearly a major, perhaps primary, cause of death for Japanese forces attempting to traverse the swamp. The exact number, whether 400, 600, or 900, is less important than the historical reality. The Battle of Ramree Island resulted in one of the worst crocodile attack events in human history, and certainly the worst documented mass crocodile attack of modern times. The Battle of Ramree Island concluded on February 22, 1945, with British forces in complete control of the island. The victory allowed Allied forces to construct airfields and supply depots that supported subsequent operations in Burma and eventually the planned invasion of Malaya. For the surviving Japanese soldiers, the trauma lasted lifetimes. Post-war interviews with survivors revealed persistent nightmares, phobias of water, and psychological damage that never fully healed. Many survivors refused to discuss their experiences, considering them too shameful. They had survived when comrades died, and in Japanese military culture, survival was sometimes viewed as failure to fulfill duty. Private Yamamoto, interviewed by historians in the 1980s, said simply, "I see them every night, the men being dragged under, the screaming. I will carry that sound to my grave." British forces also experienced psychological impacts. Soldiers who heard the night-long massacre reported nightmares and guilt. They were safe while enemy soldiers were being torn apart. Some developed lasting aversion to crocodiles or reptiles. Lieutenant Lovell's diary entries from months after the battle show recurring references to the screaming from the swamp that continued haunting him. The battle raised ethical questions about military conduct. British forces had allowed, arguably encouraged, Japanese retreat into the swamp knowing what would likely happen. Was this a legitimate military tactic, or was it effectively feeding enemy soldiers to predators? Post-war analysis concluded it was strategically sound. The swamp was enemy, chosen retreat route. British forces didn't create the crocodile danger, and preventing the retreat would have required costly frontal assaults. From a military history perspective, Ramree Island demonstrates several tactical principles. First, terrain knowledge is critical. Japanese commanders either didn't know or didn't appreciate the danger of the swamp environment. Better intelligence might have led to different tactical choices. Second, cultural factors influence decision-making. Japanese unwillingness to surrender meant commanders felt compelled to attempt hopeless breakouts rather than accept capture. This cultural factor led directly to the catastrophe. Third, nature can be a weapon. Environmental factors, disease, weather, wildlife, terrain, kill more soldiers in some conflicts than enemy action. The Pacific Theater saw tens of thousands of casualties from malaria, jungle diseases, and environmental hazards. Ramree Island was an extreme example of natural dangers overwhelming human forces. The battle also highlighted crocodile danger in military operations. Post-war military manuals for operations in crocodile habitats now include explicit warnings and procedures derived partly from Ramree Island experiences. Avoid water movement at night, maintain group cohesion, don't enter water when wounded and bleeding, conduct environmental threat assessment. Before operations, modern militaries operating in crocodile habitat, Australia, Indonesia, India, Philippines, and others, train personnel on crocodile danger and avoidance. Special operations forces conducting jungle warfare exercises in Southeast Asia and Northern Australia routinely receive briefings on saltwater crocodile behavior and locations. The battle's legacy also extends to wildlife conservation. Saltwater crocodile populations declined dramatically in the mid-20th century due to hunting for skins. By the 1970s, they were endangered throughout their range. Conservation efforts beginning in the 1980s have restored populations in many areas, including the mangrove swamps of Burma/Myanmar. Today, saltwater crocodiles in Southeast Asia face different threats. Habitat loss from coastal development, illegal hunting, and climate change affecting mangrove ecosystems. Ironically, the same swamps that killed hundreds of Japanese soldiers in 1945 are now protected wildlife habitats where crocodiles are valued for tourism and ecological importance. Ramree Island itself remains sparsely populated. The western mangrove swamps, the site of the 1945 massacre, are still avoided by local populations who know the history and respect the crocodile populations that continue to inhabit those waters. Occasional proposals to develop the island for tourism or industry face resistance partly due to environmental concerns and partly due to the area's dark history. In 2020, marine archaeologists proposed searching Ramree's swamps for remains and equipment from 1945 that might still be preserved in the anoxic mud. The proposal was rejected by Myanmar authorities partly for environmental reasons and partly because disturbing the site was considered disrespectful to the dead. The story of Ramree Island has entered popular culture. It appears in documentary films, books about unusual World War II events, and nature documentaries about crocodile behavior. It serves as cautionary tale about respecting natural dangers and as historical example of warfare's unexpected dimensions. But for those who study military history seriously, Ramree Island represents something more profound. A reminder that in war, death comes from many sources. Bullets and bombs, yes, but also disease, starvation, exposure, and sometimes the jaws of prehistoric predators that have ruled their environment for millennia and care nothing for human conflicts. The Battle of Ramree Island defies easy categorization. It was simultaneously a minor tactical engagement in a nearly forgotten theater of World War II, and the site of one of history's most extraordinary mass casualty events. The strategic outcome was straightforward. Allied victory, island secured, airbases constructed, campaign continued. From a military operational standpoint, Ramree was successful and relatively low cost. British casualties totaled 144 killed and wounded, while eliminating approximately 1,200 enemy forces. The island served its intended purpose, supporting subsequent operations. but the human cost, particularly the manner of death for hundreds of Japanese soldiers, transformed Ramree into something beyond a typical World War II battle. It became a story about the limits of human control, about nature's indifference to human conflicts, and about the prehistoric dangers that lurk in the world's wild places. Modern historians studying Ramree Island wrestle with questions that have no simple answers. How many men actually died to crocodiles? Was the number 500, 900, or somewhere between? Does the exact number matter, or is the fundamental fact that crocodiles killed more soldiers than enemy action the important historical reality? What's undeniable is that British soldiers heard screaming from the swamp throughout the night of February 19th to 20th. That Japanese survivors consistently reported massive crocodile attacks, that naturalist Bruce Wright documented extensive evidence of crocodile predation when he entered the swamp at dawn, that British medical personnel noted extreme trauma in survivors consistent with witnessing mass casualties, and that environmental conditions and crocodile behavior made large-scale predation events entirely plausible. The story persists because it touches something primal in human psychology, the fear of being eaten. Humans are apex predators in most environments, but in certain conditions, deep water, dense jungle, remote wilderness, we become prey. Ramree Island forced hundreds of soldiers to confront that reality in the most visceral way imaginable. For the saltwater crocodiles of Ramree swamps, February 19, 1945, was simply a night of abundant prey entering their territory. They responded according to millions of years of evolutionary programming: detect prey, attack, feed, repeat. They weren't evil or cruel. They were simply apex predators doing what apex predators do. For the Japanese soldiers trapped in that swamp, it was hell, an experience so terrifying, so contrary to expectations of how soldiers die, that survivors struggled to process it. They trained to face bullets and bombs, not the jaws of reptiles that had dominated Earth's waterways since the age of dinosaurs. For British soldiers who witnessed the aftermath, it was a reminder that warfare encompasses horrors beyond what armies inflict on each other. That nature doesn't care about military discipline, tactical doctrine, or strategic objectives. That a mangrove swamp populated by crocodiles is more dangerous than artillery barrages or air strikes. And for historians and the general public, Ramree Island serves as one of World War II's most unusual chapters, a battle where nature itself became the dominant weapon, where more soldiers were killed by wildlife than by military action, and where the line between military history and natural history blurred into something unprecedented. 80 years later, the screaming has long since faded. The soldiers, British and Japanese, who heard it have nearly all passed away. The crocodiles that fed that night have died of old age, replaced by new generations that have no memory of the event. But the story endures, because it represents something fundamental about the world, that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, beneath our technology and military might, beneath our assumption that humans control our environment, there still exist places and creatures that remind us we are not invincible. The mangrove swamps of Ramree Island remain, the saltwater crocodiles remain, and in the dark water under the twisted roots, the place where men go to die still lives up to its name. Of the 1,000 Japanese soldiers that entered the swamps of Ramree, only about 20 were found alive. Bruce Stanley Wright, naturalist and military observer, 1945, the crocodiles did what no amount of firepower could have done. They completely eliminated Japanese resistance on the island's western sector in a single night. British 14th Army After-Action Report, February 1945. I have never heard anything more terrifying than the sounds from that swamp. It will stay with me until I die. Lieutenant James Lovell, Royal Marines, Diary Entry, February 20th, 1945.